Doet hij het? Yeah? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this lecture. Great to see you here. My name is Willem Schoon. I'm the president of Vrije, or the Free University Society, which is an association, a community of people connected to this university in many, many ways, because they studied here, because they worked here, or just because they got involved with the themes that are being discussed here. So that's quite a big society. And you maybe remember that 2 years ago, the exercise was started up to come to a national research agenda in the Netherlands. And when that came up, anybody could enter questions to be posed to science. So we circulated to our members the suggestion to come up with questions, so we could put a bit of Free University flavor to that agenda. And one of the questions that came up was, what is the origin of evil? It's a very good question, which has been discussed for about 20 centuries or so. But we kept playing around with that question and had discussions with several researchers here, professors and senior researchers within the university, expecting someone to say, shut up, we know all about that, and go home. But no one did. So that question kept on circulating and evolving. And we ended up with a gathering of around 30 professors and senior researchers here within the Free University. Many of whom didn't know each other, didn't know each other's work, but some way got connected to this theme. And so that ended up in a plan for a minor study, a minor course, which is due to start in September. And Wolfgang Wagner, he's a professor of international security here, is the main architect of that minor. And this is the first of a series of 4 lectures, which is sort of run up to that minor. You get the minor study in a small scale. So we're very happy with that. We also tried to get to some research proposal, 1 or 2, which we can maybe get funded by NWO or else, but that's still work going on. So we're very happy with the work that Wolfgang has done, and I'll give him the floor now, and I would like to welcome you to the other 3 lectures too. We'll have 1 each month. You will find the dates on the announcement. Have lots of fun, and Wolfgang, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Willem. And it's a real pleasure to kick off this series of lectures on peace and conflict studies. As Willem said, they are kind of an appetizer for the minor program that will start in September. And within this program, I'll co-teach a course with someone from international law, and we'll deal with questions around the use of force. And what I will do today is to talk about one type of use of force, namely military interventions, and how this squares with and is embedded in democratic politics. So the politics we are used to on an almost daily basis in our home country here. So I'll do that from a political science perspective, the perspective of my own discipline. And quite simply, let me see if I have well, I'll do it this way. The reason to study military intervention, from my perspective, is that it has become a very common form of using force. Interstate wars have been in decline. They were quite common 200 years ago, less common in the last century. These days, they are really exceptional. They are still a cause of concern, of course. Think about North Korea, think about India, Pakistan, etc. But more common forms of organized violence are civil wars. Think of Syria, Libya, Mali, Congo, etc. And many of these conflicts become internationalized at some point. And this has to do also with democratic politics, because democratic publics find it very difficult to just stand by and watch and do nothing. So you see a lot of interventions, military interventions in these conflicts. And what I'm interested in is to understand a little bit the political logic of the decisions leading to these interventions. So how are they embedded in democratic politics? To what extent are they compatible or exempted from the normal democratic politics? Is there a politicization of these decisions to use military force? And is there any democratic accountability and control of them? So I'll address these questions. So I think the question, why is there evil in the world, I'll keep for a later occasion. But for now, I want to start with some theory on how about these incompatibility or compatibility between democracy and military interventions. And then I'll do something that most political scientists like doing. They do empirical research. So they look into data and then do empirical analysis to find out, is there a debate about these military interventions, and do institutions, democratic institutions, play any meaningful roles? And I think these are two important dimensions of democratic politics. So no democracy without open debate, no democracy without different opinions. So one question is, are there different opinions on military interventions, and what kind of differences do we find? And then the second one is, how does this translate into decision making? So these are the three parts of this lecture. And I want to start with these two gentlemen. I picked these two. On the left you see John Locke, and on the right you see Alexis de Tocqueville. And I picked these two because they are real icons in democratic theory. So for example, the drafters of American constitutions have all very much studied John Locke and took it as a source of inspiration in how to design a constitution for democratic society. And what's interesting about their works, both by Locke and by de Tocqueville, is that they think democracy is really incompatible with security and defense policy. So you can't have both, because the two logics are really, irreconcilable. The two logics are really very, very different. This is because, according to them, and of course they have established a tradition, and you still find these notions in contemporary thinking or in newspaper commentaries or in political debates. The argument goes if it's about security and defense, you need swift decision making. Sometimes you have to make decisions within days, hours, maybe even less than hours, whereas democracy takes time, right? You need deliberations, you need time to argue, to debate, to digest arguments, to come up with better ones. So this is one incompatibility. Another one is that, according to these theorists, security and defense often requires secrecy. So if we, for example, would consider intervening militarily in Syria and we want to decapitate the military staff, it's not very prudent to have an open debate about this beforehand. So you keep this secret. And again, well, democracy is about openness, about transparency. So again, difficult to square. And finally, and this is especially John Locke's argument, he says, well, the executive has the competence, the right to do this, to decide this on its own, whereas Parliament, for example, should deal with domestic politics. A related idea, a related notion is also that it seems a bit illegitimate to disagree over security and defense policy. So to some who subscribe to this politics stops at the water's edge paradigm, the idea would be that you can disagree over the distribution of wealth within a society, but if it comes to dealing with the third parties, with outsiders, there's an expectation of unity. I'll give you an example from the last century, when at the beginning of World War I, the German Kaiser needed money to wage this war. He had to ask parliaments for war bonds, and he gave a very famous speech saying that he doesn't recognize political parties any longer, he only knows Germans. So very patriotic appeal to overcome party political divisions. And this is very typical about debates around using force, that you will find these appeals to stop bickering as if this would be about domestic politics. It is a kind of patriotic duty to engage in a sign of unity towards an outside world. Well, this is of course more than 100 years ago, and it is in an authoritarian system, but it's not limited to these states. And here I have a kind of different visualization, but this is another famous incident, the so-called Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This is the point where the Vietnam War escalated in 1964, and it was a resolution that the president asked Congress to endorse and vote on, essentially giving the president a free hand to do whatever he seems necessary in Vietnam. And what President Johnson thought what necessary was to escalate this war and even to spread it into Laos and Cambodia. What's interesting about this resolution is that there were 2 no votes in Congress. So the House voted, 416 in favor and no one against, and 2 senators voted against the resolution and the other 88 voted in favor. So again, what you see is a little bit of the end of politics around these decisions. So no meaningful opposition, no meaningful questions about the prudence, the legitimacy of militarily intervening, or in this case, escalating the military commitment. So it's not only a theoretical idea that democracy and security defense do not go well together, but you also find some traces of this in the real world. But it's also important to note that this position has not been uncontested. So there's also a different tradition, and again, 3 nice pictures, all gentlemen, I'm afraid. Kant, Thomas Paine, Woodrow Wilson, and this is a different tradition in thinking about democracy and conflict, or democracy and peace. And what all 3 have in common is that they think they should come together. They should not be kept separate, because quite simply, few decisions are more important to citizens than going to war or not. So it would be strange to exempt these decisions from democratic accountability in general. And second, and that's more an empirical argument again, the expectation is if you have meaningful democratic control and accountability, maybe some wars would not take place in the first place. This can be the case because, for example, in 2003, when the US organized a coalition to invade Iraq militarily, the Spanish government also decided to participate in this coalition, although there was no majority in parliament to do so. There were a lot of smaller parties that were part of the government, and they were not in favor of this intervention, but because the government could decide alone, the prime minister decided Spain would participate, and they did. So this is an incident, and I'll come back to this towards the end of this lecture, where you can argue that democratic accountability could have made quite an important difference. So these are ideal, typically the 2 poles of the continuum of thinking about democracy and security defense. On the one hand, the idea that it simply doesn't go together. On the other hand, the idea that it should be brought together in order to prevent the unnecessary, imprudent use of force. And what I find interesting is to look empirically, as I said in the beginning. So how is this in liberal democracies, in Western industrialized societies? Are the decisions actually contested, and do institutions play a role? Now, there's of course, there are many colleagues of mine doing research along these lines. Some would study public opinion data, looking into what do citizens think, do they disagree over these decisions. Other would study social media, tweets, blogs, etc., or old-style media, editorials of newspapers. What I've been doing with a couple of colleagues, and here I shamelessly promote the project and the respective website, is to collect data on votes in Parliament. So we collected voting data whenever Parliament made decisions on sending troops abroad. And we started with 4 countries, the UK, France, Germany, and Spain. And we currently update the data set and look into votes in Slovakia, in the US, in Denmark, in Finland, and in Italy, I think, yeah, Italy. And this is also an open-ended process. So if anyone of you would like to contribute data on Lithuania or Ireland, you're very more than welcome. Because the more data we collect, the better we can study how do these processes of disagreements on using force, how are they structured, how are they patterned, and what can we learn by comparing them across countries. I'll show you a few results that we found. So these are votes from the British House of Commons. And you can see in green, these are votes in favor. So these are all motions on using force in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria, against Daesh in Iraq, and then Daesh in Syria. And you can see the number of members of parliament who voted in favor and the number of those who voted against. And what you can see is that it differs across these missions. So some you have a very high degree of consensus, others are more or less contested, and we'll get back to this one a little later in this lecture. Here you have a majority even against sending troops or militarily striking against Assad's Syria. That was in 2013, but I'll get back to this episode a little later. Might be interesting to note that in the UK, the government is not obliged to have a vote, so they are also at freedom to strike without parliamentary approval. This is different, for example, in Germany, and you can also see that you have many, many more votes in the German Bundestag. You can see that many of them are not very controversial, so this is mostly green. But some are, and you see the higher the, or the longer the red part in the graph, the more no votes are recorded on some of these missions. And some of the high-profile missions in Afghanistan also have also been contested. And that's a final one from Italy. First of all, you see that the number of parliaments participating in the vote fluctuates a lot. For whatever reasons. But all in all, you can see that all these decisions on should the government participate in interventions, and then you name it, Mali, Congo, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., you usually have majorities in favor, but you also have quite controversial decisions every now and then. One more slide from these voting data is that if you compare the degree of unity on deployment decisions in blue and all other decisions, all other votes in parliament on social security and environment, etc., you can also see that mostly there's more unity on these security and defense issues. So this idea that if it comes to external policies, there's a higher degree of unity. It's still a very living notion. So you can find this if you compare how do members of parliament vote on military missions as opposed to all other ones. But you can also see that it differs a bit across states, and sometimes it's pretty close. So there's virtually no difference. For example, this is the Blair government in UK, of the Cameron government, also in the UK. In some cases, you have very, very few differences between these types of votes. So that's one preliminary result, I would say, is that, of course, there's some contestation, but it's also interesting to see that it's a bit muted. So you have a more open debate, apparently more controversy around other types of decisions than military missions. A subsequent step would then be to understand, okay, so who is it who's opposing these missions? I mean, is this a random group of parliamentarians, some backbenchers in all of these parties, or are they clustering around some parties, and are these the same parties in different countries? And I've done some research on this with data from colleagues of mine who were also until recently at this university, Gary Marks, Lisbeth Hoge. They did a so-called expert survey. So they asked experts, many hundreds of experts, to give their assessment of political parties' positions on all kinds of issues, European integration, migration, etc., and to scale them on a 10-point scale. So you get a number for each political party's position on an issue. I'll show you in a second how this looks like, if this sounds still a little abstract. What's fantastic for my purposes is that at some point they included this item. So how do political parties position themselves on the question of peace and security missions? Are they strongly in favor, so that would be 0, or are they strongly opposed? And I found it a bit odd to strongly favor this as 0, so I reversed it for my own purposes. And this is what you get, for example, for the Netherlands. So I think it's always useful if you work with this kind of data sets to give it some face plausibility, to check whether you recognize any of the parties you know yourself. And the way this works is that every dot is a certain position on this left-right axis. So the further to the right, the more rightist a party is. And the higher up on this other scale, the more supportive it is, according to these experts, on supporting military interventions. And what you can see is that in the center, you have quite strong support for these interventions. So D66, the Liberals, the Christen Unie, the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, the VVD, the Liberals again. They're all quite supportive of the idea that the Netherlands should participate in military interventions. And then towards the very right and towards the very left, you have the strongest opposition. So the socialists and the PVV, the populist right, is most strongly opposed to the idea that the Netherlands should participate in these missions. For different reasons, obviously, but it's interesting to see that this is almost this kind of inverted U-curve. This is the same for a different country, for France, and you get a similar picture. So the communists are not very supportive, the Greens a little bit more, but most of the support comes from the Gaullists, from the center right. And then again, if you look at the Front National, they are a bit lukewarm at the extreme populist right again. So this seems, I guess, plausible. So this resonates with what we read in the news and what we understand from following politics. If you take all the parties that these experts coded, you get this kind of scatter plot with all the dots. Every dot is one party in one of, I think, 30 European countries. And then you can calculate how to interpret this cloud statistically. Can you actually correlate this or connect it to the idea that left-right plays a role in this? So you can ask the computer to suggest a line. The economists know, I guess, how this works, and what you get is this. So on a linear interpretation, the further to the right, the more supportive on military interventions. But an even better fit is this curve. So most support is in the center, and the least support, the most opposition then, is on the two fringes, and especially on the extreme left, whereas the extreme right is a little bit more diverse in its positions. And you can even use different sizes and different colors to also model what kind of parties are these. The bigger the dot, the more votes they received in the last election. So you can see that the opposition is not only coming from small parties, it's also the major parties of the country who are sometimes opposed. And I hope this can be seen in the back, but the green ones are governing parties and the blue ones are parties in opposition. So it's not only parties in government that are kind of obliged to support missions because of their alliance obligations or because they inherit these missions from their predecessor, but it's also parties in opposition, if they are in the center, who are highly supportive. Well, you find very few governing parties at the extreme left and the extreme right, though, but the few that are there also fit this pattern. So this I found quite interesting, to find that you have this pattern across different countries. So of course you have country-specific peculiarities. So the left, the extreme left also in France is more prepared to use force than the extreme left in Ireland or Finland, etc. So you do have country-specific qualifications of this general trend, but at the same time, if you have no idea about the Greek party system or the Czech party system, this is a pretty reliable guide to get a first estimate where you would expect support or opposition. The question, of course, is why is this the case? So where does this pattern come from? And part of it is certainly that the government honors obligations, of course, alliance obligation, but there's also an underlying story how these parties come to disagree about the use of force. Part of it is indirect and instrumental, in the sense that if you want to have a strong welfare state, you might be quite skeptical to spend a lot on the military. So there's a certain trade-off. And if you are a market liberal and you think the state should do little more than protect its citizens, but it should stay away from redistribution, you might be more open to the idea of using military force. Whereas if you're a stronger believer in redistribution, you might be very careful to support the military too much, because they compete about the same budget. That's one explanation why the left is more hesitant to endorse the use of force than the right. Another one, which I also find even more interesting, is that it's about the sense of community. So I mean, all these parties probably agree that it's perfectly legitimate to use military force to defend a community's interest. But then the question is, who is this community? And if you ask parties on the right, they would tend to say it's the nation state. And it's legitimate to use force to defend the nation in an anarchic world, in a brutal international system without a central government, etc. If you ask a party to the left, they would probably tend to say, well, the community is more cosmopolitan, it's more international, more universal, and it's legitimate to use force if human rights are violated in any place on this planet. So this is why you see some of the also social democratic green parties being quite supportive of using force if it comes to so-called humanitarian interventions. So it's a complex story, and it would be interesting to go more in depth, which I hope to do in the next couple of years. I mean, these data obviously are a little bit superficial, in the sense that the question is simply how supportive is a party towards peace and security mission, leaving open whether this is fighting terrorism, intervening on behalf of human rights violation, stopping genocides, etc. So this is not spelled out, and thus there's some ambiguity. But at the same time, you wouldn't get such a pattern and such a curve if there would not be some substance to these coding decisions. So this is one part that I find fascinating, to see that in all these liberal democracies, you have pretty stable patterns of how military interventions are debated. And all these liberal democracies are pretty much comparable in the structure of their political debates. And it's also, of course, a precondition for democratic scrutiny and democratic monitoring of military missions, that you have these kinds of debates. If there would be unity, if all these parties would agree, then you can't have a meaningful democratic debate in the first place. But having a debate is one thing, and another thing is whether this debate has any influence on actual decisions. And this is where institutions come in. And I already mentioned some of these episodes that have to do with institutions. And I think the prime institution, the most important one that plays a role in these decision-making procedures, is parliament. Courts could have some role, but in fact they don't really, and they usually decide also to stay somewhat at the sidelines. So it's all about parliaments. And I already mentioned this vote a couple of minutes ago. Here you also have a picture of the actual vote. And that's a very interesting episode, because when in 2013 Assad in Syria used chemical weapons in a suburb of Damascus, there was an enormous outcry in Western publics. And one of the leaders of the liberal democracies, who was very resolved to not let this simply pass, but to send, as he put it, a strong reply, was David Cameron, the Prime Minister in the UK. And for some reason he thought it might be useful to have a parliamentary vote on this. And then it takes a couple of days until Parliament can come together. And he proposed to Parliament that this cannot go unpunished, and there should be a military response, clearly signaling to Assad that this is entirely unacceptable. So it was about some strikes, not a major intervention, no ground troops, but some strikes on Assad's Syria. And Parliament had this debate, and they voted against it. And Cameron famously said that, well, he's kind of surprised, but he understands and he respects this vote and refrains from using force in Syria. And that was quite crucial, because in the meantime, the French President Hollande and the American President Obama had followed Cameron's lead and said, well, we should not let this pass. We should be prepared to strike militarily. But let's first see how the British House of Commons votes. And after they voted it down, both Hollande and Obama decided to refrain from using force as well. So it's an illustration of the difference that democratic institutions can make. It's fair to say that without the British Parliament, these three Western states, maybe some more, would have used force in Syria and would have further internationalized this civil war, which already has quite a strong dose of outside intervention. How does this work? I think in this case, the main mechanism was to cool down, simply by taking a little longer to make this decision. If the decision would have been left to the government alone, most likely Cameron would have ordered these strikes within a day or so. But since it took a couple of days to first convene parliament, to write a motion, to get the legal advisors on board, etc., etc., and then have this debate and have all these questions, partly from the opposition Labour Party, partly from their own backbenchers. What is the purpose of the strikes? What can we achieve? How do we make sure we don't have civilian casualties? So there's, first of all, some cooling down simply by requiring more time. But at the same time, there's also this kind of critical questioning that's typical for parliamentary control and scrutiny. And in this case, it led to a decision not to use force. So it's a famous episode, but it's also a highly untypical one. And if you study it closely, you more or less find out that Cameron totally misjudged the situation and kind of managed the process of getting a motion for parliament very badly, because usually if governments know that something goes to vote in parliament, they of course enter in conversations with leaders of the political parties. Sometimes they talk to all the political parties, trying to get as broad a consensus as possible, and making sure that the motion will not be voted down, and if necessary also compromise on the substance of the notion. So one explanation of why there are so many caveats at the NATO troops in Afghanistan, so part of the mandates where the NATO members say, for example, well, we contribute troops, but only, let's say, in a vicinity of 200 kilometers around of Kabul, or we have a caveat that they must not operate at night, or they must not use heavy weapons. This often is a result of these negotiations that the government does with the parliamentary parties. So there is reason to believe, I think, that Parliament can have these dampening effects on the government's disposition to sometimes use force. So what I did in an earlier project, in a previous project, was to look into how parliamentary war powers are regulated in different countries, in all kinds of countries, mostly in Europe, some in the Americas, but also in India, Australia, etc. And you see in dark colors countries where the government cannot deploy any troops without prior approval of parliament. So a very strong regime of control, which is the case amongst others in Ireland, in Sweden, in Germany, in Austria, in Switzerland, in Turkey, but also in Japan. But you also see, obviously, there are many countries in which this is not the case. The US, they do have this war powers resolution, but this only kicks in after 60 days. So the president makes the initial decision to use force, and then Congress has to approve this within 60 days. But once troops are on the ground, it's very difficult for a parliament to say, well, actually, we think we should call them back. So that's quite a high hurdle. The UK, France, Spain, Portugal, they all do not have these prior parliamentary approval power. By the way, Spain is one of the few countries who introduced it in the meantime, and this is also a lesson learned or a consequence from the Iraq war. As I mentioned, there was no majority in parliament to legitimize it. The government decided to intervene nevertheless, and the opposition already then said, well, this doesn't feel right, so we should make sure that in the future no government can commit troops if there's no majority at home. It seems illegitimate. And in 2004, when the opposition was elected into government, one of the first things they did was to introduce a new law making sure that from then on, Parliament would have to approve of these deployments before they take place. As one of the last parts of this talk, I would like to study a bit systematically whether we can see any influence of parliaments on governments using force. And this is, if you want, very, very primitive statistics, doesn't take any computer to run it. The idea is quite simple. If you have all these liberal democracies, members of NATO or somehow associated with NATO, so they all have the same baseline disposition to engage in these military interventions. If parliament has any pacifying effect, we would see countries with such a veto power to be especially amongst the non-participants, and we would see participants, especially countries that have no veto power, right? So this is an expectation. And this is how it looks like if you take, for example, the Kosovo intervention in 1999. So all these states here participated, all these states here did not participate, all these states have this veto power and all these states don't have it. And you can see that veto power does not make governments not intervene, because of course you can have a majority in parliament voting in favor of this. And this is what happened in Denmark and Germany. Both parliaments endorsed this intervention and thus both countries participated. But in all these countries, either parliament made clear that they would not endorse of this mission, or the government didn't even try to get a motion for parliament because they already anticipated too much opposition. So the distribution here tells you something about the influence of parliament. To be fully honest and transparent with you, of course, there are also other factors who play a role, and they are not in this, it's not possible to easily include them into this visualization, so it also depends on military capabilities available, it also depends on whether you're a full member of NATO or not. But for a start, this is some indication that this plays a role. This is a different military mission, so this is Afghanistan, and you do not see this effect very strongly, which also suggests that there are other forces that can trump these democratic politics. And I think the case in Afghanistan, the 2001 intervention, is simply that after 9/11, most countries that participated simply found it very difficult to say no to the American request to participate in Operation Enduring Freedom. Some of the neutral countries did not participate, Finland, Ireland, etc., Sweden. But you don't see the same clustering as you see here, so the effect is clearly lower. And here again you have the 2011 intervention in Libya, and again you see this effect quite strongly. So we cannot conclude that if you only have parliamentary war powers, then governments stop using force. But you can see that under some circumstances, especially if there's not a strong alliance pressure exerted on all these governments, apparently it makes it less likely that governments use force. So in that sense, there's some indication that it does play a role. If we go back to this map, and we see some countries having these war powers, other countries do not have these war powers. One question is, of course, where do these differences come from? I mean, we can see the effects, and the Spanish episodes also tells us that politicians are aware of these anticipated effects. So the socialists, when they came to power in 2004, would not have introduced this law giving parliament a veto power if they did not think that this plays a role. If they thought it doesn't make any difference, they could have saved themselves the time and effort to introduce this law. So there's some reason to expect some effect by those who design these laws and constitutions. And what you can see is that you have these veto powers, not the least in countries that had some major military failures in the past. So Germany, Austria, Italy. Well, Italy here is still blank, but in the meantime, this is also coded as having ex-ante veto power. But also Japan. These are all countries with a troubled military history. I mean, these are countries that initiated World War II, that lost World War II, that were responsible for enormous war crimes, and the generation after the generation being involved and responsible for the war decided to create as many checks and constraints on the executive as possible, including parliament making sure that no government will be allowed to simply send out troops. And of course, when other countries like the US, UK, Norway, Australia, etc., you do not have this troubled history, at least not to the same degree. I mean, in the US, it's also no coincidence that these war powers resolution was introduced after or in the final period of the Vietnam War. So it's the same logic that you design institutions in order to have an additional mechanism of control on the government. This is the underlying logic. And this also brings me to a final point I would like to make, namely that the middle part of the lecture about these political parties and this part of the lecture about institutions, they're also connected in various ways. One is, as I pointed out in the beginning, that the institution makes sure that the positions in parliament are meaningful for the decision-making process. Without parliamentary debates or decision-making power, it doesn't matter that much what parties debate. But it's also interesting to see that parties who are opposed or very skeptical of military missions are also those who are very favorable and sympathetic to these institutional checks and balances. So especially parties on the left of the political spectrum, socialist parties, green parties, some social democratic parties, they are typically quite favorable towards institutional checks such as parliamentary war powers, whereas parties that are supportive of military missions are also very hesitant to allow parliament to interfere in the decision-making process. And on a final note, because this also concerns the Netherlands and the political debates and processes in the Netherlands, it's very interesting to see that for a long period, well, let me first say that in the Netherlands you do not have a very formal ex-ante veto power, but you have informally the idea that the government should not send troops if there's not a parliamentary majority. So it's an interesting case in a kind of gray zone because it's not fully formalized, but it's a very strongly embedded and clearly practiced norm that troops should have the support of a parliamentary majority. A couple of years ago, you saw some movement towards formalization. So the idea came up, maybe we should formalize this, because what are we going to do if we have a far-right government? I mean, are they going to respect the informal rules and procedures? Or would it be prudent to have a really, rock-solid institutional, constitutional amendment that makes sure that also a PVV government could not send troops abroad without the support of a parliamentary majority? This debate at some point reached a dead end, so this amendment has not been made, and the scenario that you would have this far-right government has also not materialized. But I find it interesting to see how institutional rules and procedures are also connected to scenarios and expectations about the substantial effect they would probably have on future governments. So I think I'm reaching the end of this talk, and I want to briefly summarize these, I think 3 main conclusions, namely that military interventions are not exempted from democratic politics. So even though there is this strong tradition, this long tradition, arguing that the two are incompatible in the real world, in the really existing liberal democracies, they are not exempted. So you have controversial debates and decisions. But it's also interesting to see that there is something to this notion that politics stops at the water's edge. So the degree of contestation is far lower than on domestic politics, and governments make more of an effort to create a broad supporting coalition than they would usually do when it comes to economic policies or other domestic policies. Second, it's very interesting to see that support and opposition across all these liberal democracies is structured in very similar ways. So the center, and especially the center right, is most supportive. The fringes are most skeptical, and the far left is the most skeptical. The far right is really interesting because they are also subject to contradicting pressures, if you want. So on the one hand, there is traditionally a lot of appreciation for the military. There's a lot of appreciations for, let's say, authoritative decision-making structured. At the same time, there's very little support for the idea that the military should be used for any cosmopolitan purposes. So you will, if you look closely, you will see far-right parties, for example, supporting military action when it comes to fighting terrorism, fighting Daesh in Iraq and Syria, and far less support when it comes to peace and security missions in the Congo, in Mali, in Bosnia, etc. And finally, institutions can play a role, although this role can also be trumped by other forces such as alliance pressures. But there is reason to believe that it does make a difference whether you have strong institutions, institutionally constraining governments in deciding on the use of force. Okay, I'll leave it here. Thank you very much for your attention. And of course, we have plenty of room and time for questions. Yes, please.
Do you differentiate between offensive and defensive military missions? Like, might the far left be more inclined to do minesweeping missions or reconstruction of infrastructure?
Yeah. The data I use do not really make this differentiation, although the voting data would allow this differentiation if one would study them close, and this is what I'm in the process of doing, and then you find exactly this. So, for example, I know that Die Linke in Germany always voted against anything that the Bundeswehr would do abroad, but then when it came to the destruction of chemical weapons from Syria, for the first time they voted in favor. So you have exactly these differentiations, and you also see this in other parties, of course, and sometimes it's a bit specific to the particular party. The German liberals voted against Bundeswehr deployment in UNIFIL around, safeguarding a weapons embargo around Lebanon. But this has then to do with the specific tradition of the German liberals. But these kind of differentiations you find a lot, and offensive, defensive is certainly a major divide there. Yeah. Yes. Please.
Have you looked at the effect of coalitions? Because in the Netherlands we have a lot of coalition party, and normally they have to compromise. So they are free to.
Yeah.
So, and there are also parties who want to become part of the coalition, and normally you would maybe be very opposed to intervention if they're part of a coalition.
Yeah.
they have to
Yeah.
compromise.
Yeah, very good. I haven't studied that a lot, but colleagues of mine have, and they also find interesting case in the sense that sometimes you can have a coalition, and because one of the party is very resolved, for example, not to use force, they can veto the entire and block the entire government if you want. But what you also sometimes find is that the coalition also blurs a little bit the responsibility. So all the parties in the coalition say, well, yeah, the government decided, and we are somehow part of this, but we were not really responsible. So it can also be a mechanism that facilitates these kind of decisions because no one is the prime party responsible. So you have both effects. But I think what you also see is that parties who want to qualify for government coalitions are very careful how they vote on these missions because they know that it is very difficult to be part of a governing coalition and be totally against the deployment of troops abroad because once in government this is a very difficult policy to implement because you have to risk an enormous conflict with allies and all diplomats will tell you that this is a reputational damage that is very difficult to repair. So that also plays a big role whether parties position themselves as future governing parties or as a fundamental opposition, so to speak.
Can you then make in your graph a distinction between the blue dots, the ones that are sometimes in the government and the ones that have never been?
One could probably, yeah. It would take some work because you have to retrieve information on every single dot. But yes, I think it would be possible. And what you also see sometimes, if you have a party in opposition, let's say a Social Democratic Party, and they vote against the Afghanistan mission, then 4 years later they enter the government and then they vote in favor of prolonging these missions. And once back in opposition, they again have more liberty to be against, but to a lesser degree. So you also see these developments over time and over legislative periods that having been in government also leaves a legacy, and this usually pulls political parties towards more support of these missions. Yeah.
What I find very interesting is the question how far this support from different parties has shifted over time due to the change in justification in relation to the upcoming norm of responsibility to protect. So I was curious if you have, or if your colleagues have collected data at different times with regards to this support.
In principle, yes. I mean, these are timelines. So this starts someplace in 1990 or so, and then to 2017, and the same here.
But does that data also include the party support? Like
well, we have the data, but they're not visible in this graph. Yeah.
Okay. But do you see like certain shifts then in the data that, for instance, whether leftist parties tend to support interventions more since the upcoming responsibility to protect norm has kind of more support?
Yeah, this is the kind of research I'm busy with, and I'm planning for the next month and years. But I expect to find something like this. I mean, there are a couple of developments and movements. So one is that parties who were quite fundamentally opposed directly after the end of the Cold War, over a period of 10 years or so, became more open or supportive, at least for many or some missions. So that's typically the movement that many Green parties have made, and some Social Democratic parties as well. And then, of course, the type of mission also changes over time. And yes, I mean the Greens and also Social Democrats are typically supportive for the use of force, broadly speaking, under a responsibility to protect justification. And everything around self-defense then becomes more contested again. And the opposite is true for the political right. I mean, a related debate, maybe I can briefly talk about this as well, is to what extent this is a very good axis to begin with. So left-right is very common, and we all understand immediately what left-right means. But it's also interesting to see to what extent there are different axes that explain some of this variation as well. And one is to look into parties that are typically post-materialist. So that's the quintessential, the Green Party, the urban cosmopolitan elites, very favorable to minority rights, to homosexual rights, etc. So it's about lifestyle issues to some extent. And on the other hand, you have the typically more authoritarian, traditional nationalist parties who have a different ideal of how a community would look like. And you can also see that parties cluster along this dimension. And this also relates to the type of force they support abroad. And there the connection to the question that the force is used to save strangers, so to protect minorities, or is used for self-defense purposes. This connection is also quite strong. So there are two ways of connecting parties to the use of force. And of course, they're also connected somehow, but this explains a little bit differences between what you could call an old left and a new left. And a new left is even more open to the cosmopolitan use of force than the more traditional left. So it's Green parties versus SP type socialist parties. Yusha.
I was wondering, because you mentioned about Spain that despite the fact that Parliament outvoted intervention, the government itself initiated. Have you ever encountered something opposite of it? That, like, for example, the Parliament say yes, and then the government say no, we are not going to do it, or like.
Yeah, problem is that formally speaking, it's usually the government who has the right to propose, and the government has to approve. But what you virtually never have is a parliament who can come up with a motion to intervene someplace, and the government endorses it, and then there's a military strike. So it's almost always the other way around. But on a more informal basis, of course, you can have parliamentarians lobbying, for example, to intervene in Syria or in any other conflict, any other civil war, and this can gain some momentum. And of course, you also have, I mean, we often talk about the government and parliament as two quite distinct entities, but you also have the government and the majority party constantly discussing policy. So this is also an important channel, that if you have members of parliament who think there should be an intervention, they also lobby their own government via party channels and not necessarily via the plenary of parliament.
Also, well, of course, we don't count Iran as a diplomatic country, but I remember 4 years ago there was discussion in the parliament, and then there is a law there that if I think about 70 of the chairmen vote for an intervention, then that goes to the parliament directly, and then if the whole parliament vote for it, then it goes to the government. But the government itself outvoted it and then vetoed it. So
Okay.
that was my idea.
Yeah. Okay. It would be less typical, but yeah, of course, it's possible. Yeah.
Last question, maybe. Are you also looking to the gender aspect in your investigations? It's interesting to look if there are differences between men and women in voting.
Yeah, I haven't really studied this because this also requires that I mean, we collected data on let's say on political parties, and this already takes a long time to gather them. But then you would even have to look into every individual and then code the gender. But I wouldn't be surprised to find differences there, and I assume you would also expect females to be less supportive of using force, or at least maybe you have a similar connection to using force as you have with post-materialist and more traditional parties, but it depends on the purpose. More sympathies for humanitarian interventions. That's very possible, although it will also depend on the degree of party discipline. In some systems, this can be very strong. So in order to ensure that the party votes en bloc, there can be all kinds of disciplinary measures, and that makes it difficult for any individual member of parliament to vote against. And countries are very different in this respect. So in the US Congress, you have more individualistic culture of voting. In the Netherlands, you have a very strict party discipline to the extent that it almost suffices that in parliament during votes, you often have very few people in the plenary because they vote on behalf of their faction. And these are cultural differences across countries that will also play a role there. You had a second question? Yeah.
I was wondering if you maybe saw a correlation between death toll. In America, for example, the Iraq mission became very controversial, while the drowning missions seemingly are still very
Yeah.
granted.
Now, yeah, the challenge there is that you don't know in advance, and mostly when these decisions are made, if they are made before troops are actually sent abroad, you have some scenarios and some estimates, but more often than not, they're also terribly wrong. I mean, the Iraq invasion was thought to be over in a couple of weeks or months without a significant death toll. You have the same for Afghanistan and Vietnam, same thing. So this is difficult to take as a part of the explanation of the vote, because the vote is done with very little knowledge about the actual consequences. So it's really a leap into the dark that these parliamentarians take.
Then maybe do you see a different approach? Like it seems in Syria there is more of a bombing mission, and in Libya.
Yeah.
And is that just how politics is now evolving? That it will be much more safer.
Yeah.
military politics?
Yeah, I think what you see there is a different dimension of the democracy use of force narrative or links, in the sense that you had, especially during the second half of the Vietnam War, a lot of mobilization against the government use of force, and leading to the war powers resolution, etc., also leading to some fatigue in endorsing future missions. And what you then see is governments, militaries, also conservatives, thinking about ways how you can still intervene, even in the light of public scrutiny and strong opposition. And you can see, for example, the abolition of the draft. So you no longer have conscription, but you have a professional army. You can see investments into military technology, that is air warfare instead of ground troops. You can also see more recently a lot of delegation of these tasks to private military companies because they don't show up in these casualty figures. So you can see various ways in which democracies also try to, or let's say in which some governments try to circumvent some of these checks that have been designed to keep them on the leash. And this is also a back and forth that you can almost see as a pendulum swinging back and forth over the last decades or so. Yeah, Ronald.
I'm wondering, so what does your research can contribute to a better understanding of democracy as well? In this debate which now is going on about parties, role of parties in a parliament, debate about monetary democracy,
Yeah.
power fades away from
Yeah.
central parliament, whereas your conclusion seems to also argue for, well, parliament is still quite important when it comes to
Yeah.
interventions.
Yeah, one question that I would find particularly interesting in this context, but it's not on any of the slides here, is to take a longer term perspective and look into politicization or depoliticization over longer periods. And you find both positions theoretically, so you find those saying that the end of the Cold War means that there's a political space opening up and it's no longer about territorial defense, but about so-called wars of choice. So you would expect party political debates to really flourish since the early 1990s. But you also see the opposite position that there's this stifling of the debate because of alliance pressures and executive tendencies to securitize all kinds of things. And I think it's something in between, and I also think that it might differ across countries. But there certainly is a constant minimum of politicization, of political debate in all these countries on these questions, I would say. Marijn, you had a question.
Yeah, it's a bit related, I think, to the questions that we heard just before. So your research is very much based on the idea that there's a clear moment of decision making involved. And I was wondering if you're also interested, or whether you reflect on the idea that, as many scholars have argued over the last 15 years, that moment of decision making becomes blurred.
Yeah.
And also that the question of whether we are in or outside of, or when we are in or not in a war, also becomes blurred. So whether you see, given the sort of characteristic of so-called new wars, or because of the emergence of new technologies such as drones, sort of complicate that picture.
Yeah.
So that's one question. And the other one, which is a bit related, is that you argue that military interventions are politically contested within parliaments, although less so than domestic politics. And my question is based on the argument that decision-making becomes blurred. The question is it increasingly less contested also? So do we see a sort of increasing depoliticization of new technologies, or the outsourcing of warfare to private military companies?
Yeah. Yeah, good questions. I mean, I agree that this moment is, of course, a little bit of an idealization. So if you take, for example, the I4, S4 mission in Bosnia, I mean, there are months of negotiations about a peace agreement. And once this is achieved, there's weeks of negotiations amongst NATO members of who contributes what, or what NATO should do, etc. And then if all this is settled and agreed, it comes to Parliament, and the likelihood that this is a decision in a vacuum, that everyone has the liberty to decide yes or no following his consciousness, etc. This is extremely idealized. This is certainly not the case. And yet I think a lot of these processes are done in the shadow of knowing that there will be a vote, and anticipating that in the end, of course, you can always, from a governmental perspective, put in all your political capital and kind of force your coalition to support a certain decision, but then this capital is also spent, and you can't spend it on something else. So it's also wise to manage the entire process until the moment of decision, knowing that you ideally have a proposal in motion that can be supported in Parliament. And I think you do find this shadow in many of these negotiations. If you study how did NATO states debate on how they intervene in Afghanistan, etc., you find these caveats saying yes, but no ground troops. Well, this is not the case in Afghanistan, but let's say Libya. Yeah, it's typical that knowing the difficulties from past decisions, there's a lot of hesitation to even mention ground troops, knowing that this would either cost a lot of political capital or would not happen at all. So in that sense, and this also leads me to your second question, I also think that, I mean, parliamentarians probably do not tend to think they are just puppets in a long stream of decision making that leaves them very little room, but I think they also have a point that they can send a signal and they can make a statement. And sometimes this is done by backbenchers, also knowing that they can't prevent a decision to be taken, but simply sending a signal that this is not unanimous. And there are also parliamentarians who vote against or abstain or stay away from the vote, etc. So there are various ways of expressing a certain degree of dissent, and I would not expect to wither this away entirely because of the way use of force is organized these days. Yeah.
Talking about puppets, will you also take the military point of view in your research?
Well, I primarily take the political point of view, but of course I try to follow what militaries have to say about this and how they think about this. And I think there are also some interesting shifts over time. So I know from the Vietnam War and the decision-making around the Vietnam War is one of the best documented decision-making processes ever, I think. So you can read all these discussions the president had with top military advisors, chiefs of staff, etc., and you can see that the military typically asks for escalation, for more troops and more weapons, and some would even asked the president to consider using nuclear weapons in Vietnam, and it's the politicians who are on the hesitant side. And to some extent this has shifted a little bit since. So as you see now, militaries certainly not to be very belligerent and very demanding in we should intervene in all kinds of places, but rather cautioning politicians not to expect too much, not to or let's say to ask them to think through an intervention strategy to the point of how do we get out again, and what is the political aftermath once the military defeat has been achieved or so. So this is, I think it's an interesting development over time to see roles changing.
It's also the discussion here in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Military, they want to wait.
Yeah. You also, I saw you.
The question is about on one side on your quad chart from the power to intervene or not in participating, and it's also a bit relating to your chart about the support in the countries. And you mentioned that it's always it can be also the Catholics, but there are countries who are supporting or joining in a military operation, but with so many Catholics that you easily can say yes as a parliament, because they only have people in headquarters or only in logistics.
Yeah.
And there are countries who go full military dancing and swinging.
Yeah.
Or in time, and that's for Germany, for example, and they all have a solid support. But if you see the military operations they support in the early 90s, they had you can say a weak or limited mandate. If you compare
Yeah.
the mandates they have now, with more power to use military force. How are you going to compare that in, say, one figure or one table? Because that's puzzling.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, and I mean, it's absolutely, it's, let's say, on a more general level, this is the qualitative critique of any counting, any quantitative research, and it also applies to this. So there, on many dimensions, if you look very closely, it's very difficult to compare one vote to another, one vote in one country to a vote in another country, and also, as you said, the type of engagement is not taken into account here, and if you then look closely, you would probably find that also this undermines the idea that there are 4 categories of participating, etc. At the same time, I mean, I think there's still something to be said about comparability and something all these participants, for example, have in common, and this is, of course, militarily what, let's say, now this is not a good example, but maybe on Afghanistan, militarily what Lithuania and the US do is not comparable. But politically, they of course do comparable things in the sense that the government identifies itself and positions itself in support of a certain military mission, and they participate also for these political reasons. Militarily, it doesn't make any difference. Also, the US are very aware of this, that the Lithuanians participate or not, this is not a game-changing contribution. But politically, it does matter. And also for the Lithuanian government, it probably matters to some extent whether they do participate on a political level. Plus, of course, once you're there, this fog of war somehow kicks in, and you never know. And also, medical personnel can be fall victim to attacks, etc. And suddenly you have, I know that Georgia had quite traumatic casualties in Afghanistan, and they were probably not expecting this when they first deployed troops there. So in that sense, you are right that it is a simplification. So it's a simplification also to visualize and point out very broad patterns, and you also see this in these other graphs. I mean, this is if this is everything but a straight line, of course, and yet if you look at this, it also seems you do see some pattern that tells you a very broad story, and then to understand any specific party's position, you do have to go into detail and study in more depth what is it they are discussing. Yes, of course. Yeah.
Military in headquarters, service, boots on the ground.
I mean, this is also what I like about this topic, because you can do a lot of it, and
I'm asking this question because we're both in the military, so.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, if there are no more questions, we'll conclude this session. Thank you very much, Wolfgang.
Oh, thank you.